So tell me about George Galloway, because I know some stuff about him, but I don't know his full story. So enlighten me.
Old Georgie boy. Right. Well, so people may know that Galloway is standing in the Batley and Spen by-election, isn't he? Seem to have been parachuted in there, or some people say carpet bagging. The idea of you see a political opportunity and just go there and try and make the best of it, regardless of whether you've got any real connection to the area or anything like that. I mean, Galloway did that in 2005 in Tower Hamlets. Where was it? Around Bow in London. Just to exploit tensions there, more or less. That's what people accused him of. I completely agree with that. The Labour MP had voted with Blair to go to war in Iraq, and of course one of Galloway's main things is sort of not going to war with Arab states, regardless of anything. And so he used that to go from nowhere, from the political wilderness, to have a seat again. And it was, I've got to give it to him.
That's an amazing feat.
Yeah, that's not easily done. There's not many people in the world that you would put money on them to do that. So I think he wants to, that was with the Respect Party. His party is now the Workers' Party of Britain, or something, some nonsense he's made up. And he wants to try and recreate that in Batley and Spen, it seems. Maybe we could just talk a bit about Galloway. I mean, he's been around for a long time. One of the first things I would say is that I dislike him. I dislike his views, his worldview. No, but what I would say is I do like to dislike him. I think he is entertaining. I think he is funny sometimes. I think he's extremely clever, extremely quick, very well read. And I don't agree with his worldview, but he is something interesting. He is something, an important figure in some ways. And so, I've said to other people before, I consider him a bit like a bizarro Stefan Molyneux. I agree with nearly everything Stefan Molyneux says, but I don't like him for whatever reason. I can't really, whenever I look at Stefan Molyneux for too long, I just sort of, I don't really like him. And I feel the opposite about Galloway. I actually disagree with all his worldviews, but for whatever reason, which I can't really explain, I do like him. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Some people are charismatic, even if you don't agree with them. And I heavily don't agree with him. I mean, I think he's kind of despicable in many ways. He's an apologist for all sorts of terrible, sadistic things that have gone on in the world.
So tell me about them. I want to know.
Oh, well, okay. Well, so to begin with, he is just a committed radical leftist. I mean, openly, even in an interview with Owen Jones the other day, he said, I'm a radical leftist. I'm a radical revolutionary. You won't find many people more radical than me. I mean, openly, happily say that. It's a massive part of his life, his politics, his identity. So just straight off the bat, that gives you an idea. I don't agree with that. Most people here, most viewers, don't agree with that sort of thing. But that's where he is. He's massively pro-Palestinian. Pro-Islam, of course. But going back to his early days, I mean, he was always trying to get into the Labour Party. And, eventually did, of course. He was an MP for the Labour Party for many a year. But going back to sort of the early days of sort of like the 70s and the 80s, I mean, he was involved in sort of the miners' strike. I don't know if you know a great deal about that, sort of the Arthur Scargill stuff. And so he was sort of on their side, sort of course, I suppose. There's pictures of him with Corbyn and Tony Benn and Scargill and all that type of thing. We actually got the first picture there. It's when Galloway sat down with Uday Hussein, and there's a picture there.
People may know Uday Hussein from Count Dankula's Mad Lads on him.
Yeah, Dankula did a Mad Lads, didn't he?
Yeah.
And
Uday is a scumbag.
And so there's Galloway there's George with Uday, who, if anyone doesn't know, hasn't, not old enough to remember or hasn't read into it or hasn't seen Dankula's video, that Uday Hussein, the son of Saddam, is an actual monster. Like a serial rapist, a murderer, a torturer, just a massive sadist, among the worst people I've ever heard of. I mean, really.
So the famous story about him is pulling up to weddings that he could see on the road, and then joining himself in the wedding, walking up, handling the groom, so his boys keep him to the side, and then raping his bride-to-be in front of him, and then just walking off and leaving. And there's nothing you can do because he's Saddam Hussein's son.
Yeah, just cruising Baghdad to find a wedding party to do that to. Apparently did it loads of times, dozens, maybe hundreds of times that happened. I mean, he shot up a room full of his own friends and family at one point with an AK, just indiscriminately sweeping the room. Things like that. He had all sorts of dark dungeons and prisons where people were disappeared and dismembered and all sorts of stuff. So, yeah, a real psycho, no question. And they're still smiling away. Is the second picture, John? It's just they're shaking hands.
So what was this? A meeting in which he visited Iraq?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Why is he with Uday, not Saddam, for example?
Well, Uday was a massive player. So the thing is, George Galloway met Saddam Hussein twice, I believe. Once in 1994, which was between the two Iraq wars, and then another time just before the second Iraq war kicked off as some sort of diplomatic mission. So he met the big man a couple of times, but he met Tariq Aziz, the Iraqi prime minister, long term, like 10 times. Like he'd meet with the regime. I wouldn't say semi-regularly, but multiple times. What
was his purpose?
Just to take a dump on the West's foreign policy. I mean, what was his purpose? What is his purpose? I'd like to ask George that. Why exactly did you go to Iraq and shake hands with Uday Hussein? So what was the point of that exactly?
So from my rough reading of his history, I imagine it's there. So he's like, I want to meet with the regime because you can't. You meet with the opposition, let's say. They're the ones in power. And therefore I'm there to try and, help the Iraqi people, even though the people in charge are awful. Yeah,
I'm being a bit... not being clear there. I do know the reason, or the reasons he gives. And it's just that Western foreign policy, imperialism, whatever you want to call it, is just wrong and evil. The classic socialist, communist, Marxist thing, anything that we've done is just bad by definition. And therefore, any of our enemies are his friends. Quite as simple as that, regardless of their crimes, regardless of how disgusting the things they've said and done are. He'll happily travel across the world and shake their hands, sit down happily for a photo op. That's George Galloway. That's George Galloway for you. And he's slippery, though. He's a very slippery character. As I said, anyone who knows him, anyone who's seen any interviews with him, people like Jeremy Paxman or John Humphreys or Andrew Neil, they'll struggle. They'll struggle to pin him down and get him because he's good at what he does. He really is. You've got to give him some credit for that. As I say, I don't agree with the man, but he is sort of very, very good at defending himself. Extremely good. Well, there's a picture with obviously years after the actual miners' strike. They're all much older than they were in the 80s there, but there's Scargill and Tony Benn. And, the idea that that Thatcher trying to close down lots of coal mines and getting rid of lots of jobs, that was just a purely evil thing to do. When there's lots more at play there, and Galloway was, of course, of the opinion that anything and everything Tories ever do, regardless of any reason, should be fought against. So Arthur Scargill there, just an actual, full socialist. And later to be seen to be not on the level, but it's a very, very minor criminal as far as Galloway is concerned. But I mean, the list goes on. In like Corbyn, if it's the IRA, there's a picture of Galloway sitting with the big man himself, Saddam. And was said glowing things about the man. Said that he admired his courage and his strength, things like that. And
I too hate the Kurds.
Right? Yeah. I mean, he didn't really care too much about the Kurds at that point. I mean, he said in the first Gulf War, I don't know if you know about it in a great amount of detail, but where the aggression that Saddam it displayed towards Kuwait in the first Gulf War in 1990 to 1991. It's very, 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 very difficult to make any kind of argument that that's justified what Saddam did. He tried to annex Kuwait, essentially. That bit of land where there's loads of more oil reserves. That's just part of Iraq now. George Galloway agreed with him. Thought that was
I know the argument. So the argument is essentially that the British turned up and took Kuwait, and it should be part of Iraq as like the ninth province or whatever it is, because if it's imperialism that took Kuwait away from Iraq, therefore it belongs to them. But yeah, not a great argument for just invading and then what happened in Kuwait City, let's say.
I was going to say, right, so that's a terrible argument on the surface of it, and then throw into it the sort of the army, the tank divisions or whatever that Saddam rolled into Kuwait City, and there was some terrible things done by them.
I mean, like taking women,
theft, murder, rape,
gang raping them and then shooting them in the head while you're raping them is some of the stories I've heard. So.
But apparently the whole thing was the fault of perfidious Albion, according to Galloway. It's just our fault for having been involved in geopolitics for the last couple of hundred years before that. Because it's actually very complicated, isn't it? Like the last Shah and all sorts of things. People always bring up the Science-Picot Agreement, blah, blah, blah. But nevertheless, what Saddam did in 1990 was a terrible thing. I mean, quite clearly, just a humanitarian thing. But George Galloway defended him on that. So that's just one more example, and it goes on and on and on. It's his entire career, really. It's everything you can, like Jeremy Corbyn, any angle that can sort of dunk on England or Britain or the West, that you'll find him there. Almost.
Because he's a socialist. So I mean, something
right, yeah.
10,000 people get killed in Katyn. How do we blame this on the US? That's essentially the thinking.
Well, he said when the Soviet Union collapsed at the very end of the 80s, that was like one of the biggest catastrophes of his life, or something like that. I might not have the quote perfect there, but it was something like that, where he said, he's basically heartbroken that the Soviet bloc fell apart. That tells you a lot about the man, I think. Because the whole angle I'm trying to make here is don't trust Galloway. I don't trust him. I don't trust him as far as I can throw him. No way. He may be making the right noises at the moment in Batley and Spen, saying the things that he thinks the electorate will want to hear about freedom of speech, I don't buy it at all. Because I think he's a snake in the grass. Yeah, right. He'll say or do whatever he thinks he needs to get a seat in Parliament again. I believe that's just my opinion. He's quite a litigious fellow, so we won't go too far with what we say. But I just simply don't believe his shtick. His angle, because we've got decades of what he's done. Do you take someone on the last speech they made or on the decades of actions they took? Because I just think it's a little bit. It would be a bit gullible of people in Batley and Spen to just take him on the last speech he made and just say, oh, he's saying the things I like right now, so I'll give him my vote. I mean, they haven't got any great options in Batley and Spen, to be quite fair. But don't vote for someone like that. I mean, it's he had a famous debate with Christopher Hitchens, the late great Christopher Hitchens. There's a picture of it there in America, and they're talking about foreign policy and the Iraq War. It's in about 2005, so just a couple of years after that second Iraq War. And I actually rewatched it recently. I've watched it 2 or 3 times now. It's a really good one. It's a really, really good one. And I did think, until I rewatched it recently, that Galloway acquitted himself very well. And there's not many people that go head-to-head with Christopher Hitchens and come out not completely destroyed, which is what he does. Hitchens actually didn't annihilate him. And not many people can boast that, to be quite honest. However, rewatching it recently, I do think that Hitchens came out on top. But I actually don't agree with Hitchens. I agree with Galloway. I think the second Gulf War was unjust, trumped up, and all sorts of other things. That's one of the other things I would say about George Galloway, is that he is interesting. He is better than most of the people on the left, someone like Owen Jones, for example, where he will come out with something that's a bit off the main beam, that isn't, purely in the canon of the accepted things the left should say. And that's becoming more and more rarer and rarer, isn't it? Where, for example, he was sort of pro-Brexit. Galloway was kind of pro-Brexit. Sorry, I'm a little bit out of sync here. Let's talk about the Senate hearing. Again, back in about 2005 it was. Galloway had was called before a Senate committee on Homeland Security and asked about whether he'd ever received money from the Iraqi regime, basically, oil for money. There he is on C-SPAN, and he absolutely smashed them. It's great. You know, again, I'm not on his side, but it's great to watch him just smash that Senate committee. If anyone wants to look that up, I advise they do, because it is really good stuff. I realise running out of time a little bit here. So, well, another thing in his party was on Big Brother, the most cringy. People use the word cringe very freely these days, don't they? It's almost like a go-to word, go-to term. This is among the most cringy things. There's the late, not great Pete Burns with him. It's so cringy. It's like the worst. There's a couple of things. There's this bit, and then there's another bit where he's role-playing as a cat, and there's some weird sexual undertones with the woman. It's like, I can't watch. In fact, I tried to watch the clip earlier this morning, and I got about 50 seconds in. I just couldn't do it. It's one of the worst things ever. But it's so embarrassing. It feels like an ad hominem thing to bring it up. But nevertheless, that's where it is. Oh, no, my point was going to be
that... ad hominem to bring up his past.
Well, yeah, not ad hominem. That's the wrong phrase. But the point I was going to try and make with it is that... he's shameless. He's a shameless self-publicist. Will do or say almost anything for attention or to keep his career alive. So he might come across as a very sincere man, a very, very serious, cerebral man, and he is on many levels, but also cretinous, as that picture testifies. He's a fan of Assad. There you go, sitting with Assad. I mean,
so is he an Arab nationalist then?
Well, he's pro anyone that is our... he said he loved the Ba'athist party.
Okay.
Yeah, so, again, if at the time, I think probably Cameron and people like that wanted to get rid of Assad, so he'll go over there then, and be his friend, shake his hand, have a photo opportunity. Doesn't really matter about the killings, the murders. Doesn't really matter about that. It's more important that George can have a photo up with someone on.
But no, that's also pretty socialist behaviour. It's just anti-American.
Yeah,
you know, the Assad regime is not pro-American, therefore I support them.
Oh yeah, that will be his justification for it, for sure. And then we'll get on to the Brexit thing. So it's surprising that sometimes you'll find him saying something, you'd be like, oh, I didn't think a sort of an arch socialist would go there. But he did. I think Nigel's face there says it all. I think can't quite believe it's comical that Galloway would join. But to be fair, actually, there is an argument, from the left why we shouldn't be in Europe, which Galloway has held for a long, long time. People like Tony Benn held it. They want to collectivise your children and things like that and get rid of a freedom of press, and they don't want to be answer to anyone in Strasbourg or Brussels. That's what it is. That's why Galloway is not a fan. I mean, he'll say it's to do with democracy. I don't believe it. I just don't believe it. It's not to do with that, in my opinion. But anyways, we are running out of time. Let's go back to Batley and Spen real quick. And Lotus put up a video of his sort of 10-minute odd speech the other day, didn't we? And he was talking about the good things like freedom of speech and talking about freedom of speech and how the teacher had been hard done by and all that sort of thing, and how the Joe Cox murder is a terrible thing, etc., etc., etc. All the things you would expect the normal electorate of West Yorkshire constituency to want to hear. I would suggest it's all disingenuous. I would suggest the man's a Marxist. Doesn't really care about freedom of speech. He didn't care when the Saddam crime family, the Hussein crime family. There's no freedom of speech there. I don't remember him bringing it up. There wasn't a point. I don't believe he asked Assad about the levels of freedom of the press in Syria. I don't think he really cares about it. I think it's what he's calculated correctly that there's a chink in Labour's armour there, and it might lead to him getting a seat back. He cares about council culture once they came for him. Yeah. Once it wasn't in his interest, once they accuse him of being far right, which is of course absurd, but yeah, that's beyond the pale, and he needs to speak up and say something about it at that point. It's just he accused Hitchens once of being a slug who left a trail of slime behind him. I think that's ironic. I think that's exactly what Galloway himself is.
So that's why you don't think he's legit in Batley and Spen. There's no reason to support him.
No, he's been parachuted in there, or he's parachuted himself in there to try and stick it to Labour, because obviously Labour got rid of him back in the Blair years when he spoke out against Gulf War II, telling our soldiers to disobey orders and that sort of thing, and that the death squads were justified in some way. It was normal to have sectarian bombings every day or whatever, just crazy nonsense, just whatever he needs to say to justify the weirdo boomer position he's got. He's a throwback. I don't buy it.
If you enjoyed this segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can watch the full broadcast live every weekday at 1 p.m. UK time on lotuseaters.com.